study. Here's a little joke. I don't necessarily say jokes like this. It's not my own joke, but it is funny. So it's the one time I can have justification to say it. There was a person, the story is told, who was only semi-illiterate and couldn't read very well, but he decided he wanted to get closer to God and read that Bible. So he pushed his way through Genesis. And then that was about the hardest thing he'd ever done. But then he kept wading through Exodus. When he got done with that, he was so exhausted and it was so hard for him. But then he turned the cover of the page to the next book and he tried to sound out the title of that book. And he said it was something like Leviticus, and so he did. All right, that's just kind of funny for you there. I don't know if you feel that way or not, but if you're keeping up with the readings, and I'm not going to obligate you or put too much peer pressure on you. We're still going to let you in the building on Sunday morning if you haven't done the readings. But when we're all on board going through a journey like this, it's just a good reason to get as much out of the study as possible. For example, if you're working out or doing something where you can listen to something, audio input, you can listen to the text, and that is a good alternative as well. When you're going through these major or minor reading assignments, if you've done this before, some of you are waiting till afterwards, after the class, you hear more of it that way, that's great. But if you've already listened through some of this, you might feel like a lot of other people, or maybe like that person I joked about, where you just think, this is beyond me, so many details and rules and details I don't understand and hard to pronounce. It doesn't read like a narrative, it's just a bunch of instructions, left and right, endless details, and it's not easy to read. But I guarantee you that after tonight, with focused attention, you will appreciate this book. You will appreciate this book so much more because you'll have a deeper appreciation, or I should say understanding of its content. Yes, when we understand something more and understand the application it is to our lives, it's in the Bible for a reason. It will mean more to you. Whether you have minor study or major study in this particular book, you will likely come back and have the same statement. And I've heard this statement already from some. Literally, and they're not taking the Lord's name in vain when they truly mean this. Thank God we are not under that covenant, right? Now, you may read this book and see this, but notice I said whether you have major or minor study in this book, you will walk away with the same stated relief. I'm so glad we're not under these rules. But why would you say that? What level are you at when you say that? Do you look at, like a human nature would be, all these rules and think, I'm thankful I don't have to remember and follow all these? Yes, that's natural. But do you look at this with major study or with spiritual insight and say, I'm so thankful for the power that's been revealed from the one who was the ultimate sacrifice? If that's why you say, I'm glad we're not under that anymore, then maybe that's the level we're going to get to after tonight. Here we go. Looking at some scribbled notes here. I'm thankful for my pencil mark. It lets me know where I'm going. By the way, did I show you how crazy this looks on my notes as I'm driving? Here we go. Leviticus shouts out more than maybe any other book of the New Testament and Old Testament, and this says a lot. Leviticus shouts out that we finally have full atonement. Beautiful, isn't it? We needed full atonement, and people who lived in this covenant, they were right in their obedience to God's given will. But, in the time of Christ, we understand full atonement. Now, we will be with them with heaven, and we'll deal with that detail later, but this is so beautiful. Now, we're still in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, which establish the reason we're here, the fall of man, the sin, the promise of Abraham, and the calling out of the Israelites from Egypt, yes, and then making them a people. That's where we essentially are, making them a people holy unto themselves. If you understand the Pentateuch, then the history of the Israelites, which is everything that follows, like cards, you can shuffle the deck, some things overlap, but this is the core, the foundation from which everything is built on. Then we can move forward. We're at Exodus today, or I should say after Exodus. Leviticus literally bleeds from the other. That's a pun, in a sense, based on what it all is about, sacrifice. But in Leviticus, we see Christ as the sacrifice. And it's hard to pick one sacrifice that makes a difference more than the other because there are so many. But in one list that I found, which is on this screen, the scapegoat. The idea of our sin being put upon another and moved away from us. It's a beautiful imagery or type. But as you look at Leviticus, the whole book is typified in Christ. Everything you see Christ everywhere. And that's something so beautiful to pay attention to. We have here that 3-minute Bible study, but I'm pressed for time tonight. We're just going to skip it. I know, can you believe it? So I'll click twice. Boom. Move on from that 3-minute Bible study survey. We're doing it now. The Bible ultimately points to Jesus Christ, and that's what matters. Here is the period of time that we are in right now, the wilderness wanderings. We're already up to the wilderness wanderings. The code that was given during the days after the Exodus from Egypt, but just before entering the land of Canaan as conquest under Joshua. So we're in that time frame here, and there's a lot of years, and this is the time frame where a lot of writing was done, and it's great to have this preserved for us. We have here a scanned introduction of the Look at the Book series. Remember that? They did an Old Testament journey through this, and I like what it was said. It was specifically to the Levites, yes, we know that, but it was written immediately after the book of Exodus, and probably after the building of the tabernacle. That little red dot reminds me to click right here to remind you of what that tabernacle looked like, at least one artist's rendition of it. And so it lets us see this is the central spot that represents the presence of God. Last week we talked about the instructions of how it was to be built, the significance to the measurements, the furniture inside the temple proper, the sacrifice that was to be offered by the priests, and then the one priest that go into the Holy of Holies once a year to make atonement for all. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So we're moving now to the introduction as is on your outline. So here's where we'll follow along on your outline. The introduction. It's a difficult book. Seemingly endless details of laws, statutes, feast days, festivals, sacrifices. And frankly, if you're taking your eye off the bigger picture, it can sound a little boring. It's not read like a story. So you've got to have a vested interest in it. And our vested interest are many things. Caring about Christ for sure. So, however, the book can have vital background information for a genuine appreciation for the saving work of Jesus. That's a very academic way of saying you will not understand the full blessing of being in Christ if you don't understand this book. That's essentially what that says. The more you understand the book of Leviticus, you will rejoice. And the next time we have communion comments and focus on participating and communing with the Lord and one another at that time on the Lord's Day, if you focus on Leviticus, you will most likely have your heart in the right place after tonight. I'm excited for that. More directly, this book deals with the Gospels and the background of Jesus' work and ministry than maybe any other. It's that important. And how sad it is then that it's one of the least studied books of the Old Testament. How sad, right? So what we're doing tonight, we're focusing on how everything pointed to Christ. And as you read or listen to Leviticus, if you haven't already, you'll notice the focus was on that Day of Atonement. It seems to always get to that, and a lot of spotlight is on that Day of Atonement. Well, we need atonement. When did that take place for us? How beautiful it is that all of this is typified in Christ, even the Levitical priestly system itself. Wow. So Leviticus is derived from its name of the Septuagint. It's not a Hebrew word, but it's from the Greek translation of it. And there's a lot of stuff here to read. You can screenshot that if you want to. I think it's beautiful. But I want to read the middle paragraph. Given in the day of the types and shadowings, Leviticus teaches us that sinfulness of sin, or the horror of transgression, I don't like that. I prefer to not be redundant if at all possible. The horror of transgression and sin, that true holiness can be found only in the Messiah. In that respect, Leviticus is a schoolmaster who prompts us to Christ. And that's why we're reading this. It's so beautiful that we are children of God, not just children, but priests. That's where we're going. If you think we're studying about some other culture long ago when they had priests, well, we are now too. So when we understand Leviticus, we respect the role that Christ has elevated us to. So Leviticus means, letter A, pertaining to the Levites. That's it. It's a title that lets us know this book was primarily written to the Levites, but was to be understood by all. It was to let them know their priestly functions and how that would relegate the people. Organize them structurally to know how they can approach God. And they depended on the priests a lot in God's way, not like we would see today, but certainly in God's system is beautiful. And of course, it just mirrors what we have now in Christ. But it also shows so much more. Yes, Moses wrote this, but after they were called out of Egypt and called to be God's people, God is letting them know how to be separate from the world. Sometimes we focus on the Levitical code and we see the beauty of the scientific foreknowledge, the wisdom of the medical rules and dietary restrictions and how to be sanitized, and we see the wisdom and glory of God to take care of His people. But sometimes we have to realize we have to be holy by just doing what God says to do. And that's an emphasis that I want to draw to tonight in this regard. Doing what God says to do, that is full surrender. That's what makes us holy. That's what makes us different from the world. God has given us a system. We live according to His will. So what's the purpose of the book? It's twofold. The purpose of the book is twofold. The way to God. This book is to show us the way to God. And it teaches us how to walk with God. When I say us, I'm talking about the children of Israel, of course, the people of the day, and yet that's the principle. How are we to go to God? Here is an outline that was similar, and I like the way it was wording itself. The ways, it shows two divisions of the whole book, approaching God and abiding with God. How can we approach God and how can we abide with Him? And it boils down to essentially, we approach God by sacrifice. And you can write that down in the margin of your notes. What's the way to God? Sacrifice. It's always been that, and it always has been, always will be. Sacrifice is the way to God after the fall of, or the entry of sin, the fall of man. And to teach us how to walk with God, what's that mean? The key word, obedience. Sacrifice is the way that we come to God, and obedience is the way we abide with God. It's beautiful. Here is a background section now. Background of the book. The contents were likely given to Moses while he camped around Sinai. This is a very interesting idea. The Ten Commandments and that core law is what we saw, and I showed this to you last time. And there are three categories of the instructions. You got the commandments, the judgments, and the ordinances, each with their particular purpose. But tonight we're focusing on the ordinances, that they governed their religious lives so that the people would know how to approach God in the terms that He dictates. And that's the idea. I was asked recently about the idea of spirit and in truth, and I focused more so on the truth for this conversation. Spirit is the right heart. Truth is doing it God's way. So the right spirit and the right heart says, God, tell me your way and I will do it. And that is the right balance. And it's done in the right heart, for sure. So how am I supposed to obey you, God? How am I supposed to come close to you, God? God has given us ways by which we do that. And we're studying the Old Testament, what He told the people then, the Israelites during this time. We have here letter B. This is a lengthy description. The commands were for proper living, rules for observance of feast days, festivals, and holy days. What's our vested interest in studying this? Again, I want to remind you, our vested interest is this, and I'll extend the explanation. Number one, it's inspired of God. I want to read what my Creator wants me to know. Okay. Second, it's because it helps us understand what Christ ultimately did for us. The more you understand Leviticus, the more you'll say, oh, I see how Christ is typified in this. Or I should say how the Levitical code is typified in what Christ accomplished. I understand more of what He did. This is incredible. And it builds our faith. But also, when we read about all these things that the Levites were doing, we realize that, or I should say the priests of the Levitical tribe, we realize that we are priests. We are holy priests to God, and so it's very important to take our role, Christian life, seriously, and then realize that Christ is our holy priest. We come to Him. We still have a high priest system, and it's Christ, but we are His priests. How beautiful the blessings that we have that come to us only by studying of this. So let's continue with section main message of the book. Here's the key first word in this section. Main message, the primary message of Leviticus is holiness. If I were to boil down, and other people do the same, they have different words, but holiness, I think, is my favorite one-word summary of the whole book. holiness. The Levitical code itself, that is to say the whole book, is sometimes referred to by scholars as the holiness code. I think I already slipped out that word a little bit myself, knowing where I was going with this. The holiness code. And I'll maybe encourage you to see it in the same way. The main message is summarized by Leviticus 11:45, or in your margin, the side note there, you can put chapter 20, verse 26. This is the same thing, same message, but worded differently. I like both wordings well. But here's the key. Be holy as I am holy. God is holy. He has chosen us to be His people. We are to be holy. Now, God is holy and perfect. When it comes to humanity, we're not going to be perfect, but we can be holy. We can choose to be faithful. We can commit to His will and be holy, set apart, sanctified, consecrated. And that's the idea that's the idea of this, the connection between Leviticus and us in Christ. God calls us to be holy, and we're going to follow Him. We're going to be consecrated, set apart by following His will. And here, how we're going to do this? Well, it's listed for you. We follow God's divine law. That's how to be holy. Some people say, I have a relationship with God, but they're not following His law. You can fool yourself into thinking that you can make God into whoever you want, but if you're not following God's law and a desire to learn it, then that's not following God's law. But to be holy and consecrated, point 2, it's offering sacrifice to atone for sin. Well, in the New Testament, we are thankful that carries over. The perfect sacrifice, the perfect law reveals our need for sacrifice, and we have that in Christ now. But our sacrifice is a fully yielded life as we continue following His law, so it connects. And then punishing sin within their community. Now, I'm not going to make a connection with this just yet. I want to stay focused on the historical narrative. They had to. It's not about punishing the law as much as it is letting them know that the most important thing is following the holiness code. But in order to establish that rule for humanity's sake, and this is the way it is, this is the way it, contrary to popular opinion, human nature is the case that you have to punish an act that you do not want to continue. So, punishing sin within their community, and you've heard some of these stern stipulations or punishments, sometimes even capital punishment for things like adultery, bestiality, and even blaspheming against your parents. And you think about how much times have changed, but you think about this and you realize how God feels toward things today and how important it is to live according to God's Word. So with all this being said, to protect and consecrate a holy people, there are some stiff penalties. And yet, the focus is always on the importance of following the holiness code. We have an outline of the book, which is one in the same of our main themes. So this is not a section I will spend too much time on from class to class. This is for your benefit. I often want to remind you of how I study, and it's helped you a lot too. Some of you have said it helps. Listen to the book while looking at the outline. That way, all the details that you're hearing are not distracting you. All those bits of information are being categorized in the subfolder of your mind, and all that information is being put where it belongs. Okay, we're under the law. The law's dealing with the sacrifices, and we're talking about these sacrifices. Got it. I'm going to get more familiar with those later, maybe, but right now I'm seeing where this is going. Toggle Bible study with the outline, and that helps a whole lot. Key themes of the book. Here we go. Let me flip the page and be with you here. Key themes. Page 2. The concept of sacrifice. This is what it's all about. This is the key theme. And in the margin of your notes, this is a very important statement to write down. Sacrifice is the means by which sin-stained humans come before God in any generation. In our Sunday morning series, kick off to the whole year, we are focusing on how important it is to see the differences of the Old and New Covenant, but also their similarities. This is where the beauty truth comes in of what God knew all along. Sacrifice is the means by which sin-stained humans come before God in any generation. That's a truth statement, but it applies differently based on the covenant that you're in, and of course we're in Christ. So just remember that. We're going to come back to that. We have here Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. I have every verse queued up, but it takes time to speak. So I will encourage you to circle this and read Leviticus 17:11. This is a key verse to understanding the role of Christ and the whole concept behind sacrifice. You know this verse whether you know it or not. If you've heard a preacher say something about the life and the blood and atonement, then he goes back to this, and you know this teaching. Here it is. And I've reworded it for the purposes. You can write it word for word later. But here's the idea. The life is in the blood. If someone asks you, why did Jesus have to die? Or why did they offer so many animal sacrifices back in the day? You might be ready to tell them after this class. The life is in the blood, and the blood makes atonement. Atonement's a big word, and take a few moments to figure out how to explain that word briefly to someone else. Basically, in its raw form, atonement means... Oh, I've given you a slide for that. Atonement means payment or substitute. Someone else paying a debt that you couldn't pay. Chronologically, everyone in the Old Testament before Christ, what were they to do? Well, God gave them a way to make atonement, and it's a beautiful thing. And now, when you're reading about all of the, shall I say, blood, guts, and gore that's found, I mean, Leviticus is a red book. It's red stained. It bleeds sacrifice and blood. Why? Well, sin is not exactly a good thing either. I mean, it's not very pleasant itself, is it? So yes, you can look and see how horrible this is. However, you can see how beautiful it is that God provided a way for atonement. Someone else paying a debt that I could not pay. A sacrifice is signified by payment or substitute. So here, same words, substitution. But a sacrifice signified the substitution of that payment. So let's say I'm before God and I've sinned. What do? God provided a way by which I can be atoned by faith. By faith is so important. Remember that. Not by our doing, but by something else. So, we're dealing with relationships, we're dealing with reconciliation, and a simple definition of atonement is to just divide the word by the syllables, at-one-ment. God provided a way by which we, after sin, can have an at-one-ment situation. Again, reconciliation. That's fun to say, at-one-ment, reconciliation. Quick explanation. How does all this make sense to us? Here are some verses to write down and study later, and study well in their order. If you get the concepts of these verses in your mind, you may not remember the numbers or where they're found, but at least you can give answers to questions that people ask. What does all this mean about animal sacrifice and blood and atonement? How does it work together for you and I today in Christ? I'm in my margin note space, by the way, so this don't try to find me on the page. I'm in the section just after key themes in the margins. Sin is a transgression. Let's say I care about God. Let's say that I want to be right with God and I own up to my sin. What am I supposed to do? 1 John 3:4 says that I'm separated from God in that sense, and I must have atonement. The wages of sin is death, Romans 3:23. Since, sin takes me away from God. I want to be with God. Universal problem. What's the universal problem? Sin. Leviticus deals with sin, and it shows us how terrible it is. And it shows us how nothing can take care of it. Remember that. But here's the great news. The gracious God sought atonement for us. He sought a way for even the people back then to make atonement. Don't think that the Old Testament God is so mean and coarse and cruel that you don't see His grace. Remember, He's the judge. I'm going to get too far ahead of myself here, but in the Old Testament, we see the grace of God making way for atonement for anyone who follows Him. It's a beautiful thing. Beautiful. So under the Old Testament, what do I do if I sin and I'm under the law of Moses? I bring an animal sacrifice so that the shed blood of that animal, by God's prescriptions that I obey in faith, can be shed as a substitutionary atonement for me. I am making that in faith based on the prescriptions of God in that covenant, and that is able to make atonement for me. Now, some of you may say, well, but Michael, I know that something's not right with what you just said, because Hebrews 10:4 and Hebrews 9:23 says that the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. That's exactly right. We know that now in the New Testament. And don't you think the people back then knew that because they kept offering those sacrifices day after day, year after year? They knew it wasn't the ultimate sacrifice. They were looking to something. They didn't always exactly know what, but now we do. And we appreciate that power of Christ so much more. But we in the Old Testament would make this sin offering, this sacrifice. And this is very important. Going back to the top message here, the means by which any human comes before God is sacrifice. All of these sacrifices in the Old Testament, all of them, were types, foreshadowings of the real sacrifice. The whole book of Leviticus is typified in Jesus Christ. And all these sacrifices that you hear about and will read about, they were instruments of forgiveness. Yes, they were instruments of forgiveness because, in the Old Testament here, they were made by faith in accordance with the terms of the covenant that they lived under. And symbolizing the real source of forgiveness. All those sacrifices made in faith by God's prescription with the right heart signified what was going to come. And in God's eyes, that did the trick because God knew He was going to send His Son to die. Isn't that beautiful? That's beautiful. So and this is very important to listen carefully. Please don't take this out of context because I've preached here for 7.5 years and you know I emphasize baptism because that's in the covenant today. But it's not a goat's blood, nor is it the water in the baptistry that takes away sin. However, it's the obedience by faith in God's prescription of covenant law that we follow. That's where it is. Response in faith. The obedient heart that surrenders to God's will and do the things that He has said that ultimately points to the ultimate source of forgiveness, and that's the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. All this Old Testament sacrifice system points to the cross, and everything we do now points back to the cross, and we live in so much freedom because Christ nullified the old, being the ultimate sacrifice. It's a beautiful thing. Okay, that's a heavy slide. We have 5 types of sacrifices outlined in Leviticus. I was eager to verbalize the speaking of some of these and tell you a little bit more about them, but with what you have available, and time's sake, this is what you can know, and screenshot this, and enjoy learning about the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering. All of these, by the way, were voluntary. You can do them on your own accord and when you feel like you should. But the sin offering, the guilt offering, those were obligatory. Those were mandatory. Those were ones especially for serious harming of things like, blaspheming God, when you harmed another person, or were a poor steward of someone else's property or your own. Maybe you didn't give God what He deserves, and that's a sin, and you end up with less as a result. This is just amazing. So there is a distinction between the sin and the guilt offering, but some of those are overlapping themes as well. But have fun learning all about these as you can, reading them, studying them from the Scriptures. The first 3 of these sacrifices, I mentioned that, were voluntary, the others were not. But the entire system, point 5, the entire system of sacrifice pointed to the ultimate and fulfilling sacrifice of Jesus the Christ. Here is more information for you to see and learn. I'm not going to read every detail, but in the burnt offering, we're going to focus now on how everything points to Jesus, right? Even the types of sacrifices. In the middle of this bottom paragraph, the burnt offering, is typified in the death of Christ as being a complete and perfect act of obedience to the will of God, a full surrendering. It's all burned up. It's given to God. Our lives are that way, totally yielded. The meal offering or cereal grain offering, every meal offering points to Christ's daily consecration of His workers for all of His works to the Father. He as our sustainer. The peace offering. Okay, in the middle of that, Christ is our peace. That's an easy comparison. But when we understand the peace of being in a right relationship with Him, it's because of His sacrifice. We can have peace with God. Beautiful, beautiful. The sin offering, the serious one that's obligatory, these sacrifices impressed upon the mind that it was sin that had removed man from the fellowship with God. And guess what? Christ is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. He is the sin offering. And when you appreciate how serious the offense is to have such a ultimate sacrifice and moment of offering, and then you see how Jesus is the same, it just adds a dynamic of understanding to see that this was truly not an easy thing to do. But He sacrificed so much for us. The trespass offering, last two sentences, I think, 3 lines up from the right. Even if we did all that was commanded, we are still unprofitable servants. Jesus Christ is our trespass offering and our satisfaction. Only in the cross will men be justified or humanity be saved. This is very serious. So He is our answer to everything. The whole Levitical system points to Christ. Oh, and the priesthood as well. The priesthood. Point number 2 at the bottom. All priests had to be from the tribe of Levi. We remember that. Selected by Moses, Aaron, and his sons. Page 3, point 3. Priests served as mediators between people and God. They were a type of Christ, of the intercessory work of Christ. But now, I encourage you to read chapter 9 of Hebrews. When you get to chapter 9 in our Sunday morning class with Ron, I hope you remember this class. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 15 explain how everything the priests did is what Christ is doing for us. And now we are priests, called to be holy. So we don't go to another priest or another person. I wish people understood that across the religious world. But we do go to Christ. And that's a beautiful thing. He is justly our high priest. He entered the Holy of Holies. Remember, that temple veil was torn spiritually as well. We can approach God. Letter C, the festivals and the feast days. These are fun to learn about. I tell you, these are really fun. The Sabbath, it was meant to be a day of joy and relaxation and rejuvenation, but the Pharisees came along and made rules that made it annoying and just miserable. They had, you have this concept of don't work, but then they described so many things that they thought was work to make sure that they don't break the law, and they ended up being so oppressive. This is not the way it should be. The principle should not be that way. So, point 2, the Passover is the most important one. That's it right there. The Passover reminded Israel of God's deliverance. And you can find the Passover by when spring starts, the first full moon after that, and then the next Sabbath after that. So spring, the first full moon, the Sabbath right after. The unleavened bread feast. This is interesting. It followed a whole week after the Passover, and it prolonged the celebration. And it's still observed in that area today, but meanings may be lost or changed. But they were to eat unleavened bread all week to continue observance of what God has done. The Pentecost, or the Feast of Harvest, 50 days after Passover. The Pentecost was a Thanksgiving holiday. It was with a great harvest. It was a good day. The Feast of Trumpets, okay. Starts of the Hebrew New Year. I think that's the bell. It sounded different. But the Day of Atonement, this is it, the Day of Atonement. I mentioned earlier that everything points to this, and I'm emphasizing this for a reason as well. The key word in my mind, other than holiness, is atonement. I need to be atoned to be holy. How can I be holy when I've got sin that nothing can take away? Well, let's read what it says here. Point 6. This was to be one day each year when the high priest, I hope you're thinking with foreshadowings in mind, when the high priest entered into the Holy of Holies to offer the sacrifice for the sin of all the people. Unlike the other feasts, this was a day of fasting and mourning. Everything else was a joyous occasion, and this is wonderful, but this was a day where everyone was called to remind themselves, as if they, well, yeah, they still needed reminding, just how serious sin is and the need for mercy. The need for mercy. Lest they think in their mind that all these sacrifices are doing the trick for them and I'm right with the Lord because I offered a sacrifice yesterday, but their hearts are still far from Him. That human nature does the same thing today. Oh, I attended a service today. I'm doing all right with the Lord. Well, let's make sure you are. This holiday, this focused day for commended observance is to remind them their need for mercy. It's not a feast. They were commanded to fast. And in fact, when you see the name Yom Kippur, or the title Yom Kippur in your calendar, this is what we're talking about. And also now the Feast of Tabernacles, they were they were to live in tents during that time because it reminded them of what God had done for their ancestors. I know you have a lot of blanks to fill in, so let's do those quickly. We didn't talk much about these feasts and holidays, but everything's provided for you on the outline to enjoy studying from the Scriptures on your own at this point. A lot of extra stuff we could have shared, but this is the base. Think about it for a little while. The holy days of the Hebrew people were symbolic of the wonderful aspects of God's very nature. God's nature. What would you, as a Jew or an Israelite at the time, look at the Sabbath as? The holiday of the Sabbath. What would that show God as to you? Well, he rested after creation. So the holiday of the Sabbath would remind you that God is creator. I mean, that's the base core of that, and the rejuvenator, actually, as well. The Passover holiday, well, goes back to the Exodus. So what would that remind you of? God delivered you. The Pentecost holiday, the springtime, of course, and the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. Both of those would remind you of, as we remember many things, I hear that bell again, this is for your benefit, the provider or the sustainer. God took care of you in the wilderness, and God will sustain you as you go, so the straps on your sandals won't even wear out, right? The Day of Atonement, and this is the key one, that God as holy and gracious. The Day of Atonement. As a Christian, brethren, I hope that you mentally review all of these holidays that are part of your heritage of faith, and also let them remind you that God are these things to you today. God is these things to you today. He's your creator, deliverer, provider, sustainer, and he's called you to be holy because he is holy. Here's a screenshot of major lessons that essentially say the same thing, but I particularly like, which one was it? Yeah, number 5. Blood is the means of atonement. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and it is the blood that makes us one with God. I thoroughly enjoyed studying for this lesson, and I hope that it encourages you to appreciate Leviticus like never before. If you can not get bogged down with the details or sidetracked with the descriptions, I encourage you, if you haven't already, just listen to this book and keep those main points in your mind. God has done so much for us. So much for us. Next week, Numbers. Lots and lots of counting. What's that all about? We're going to have some fun. Thank you all so much for your time, which goes by so quickly. Enjoy the fellowship.